Welcome to St. Thomas Episcopal Church. We're looking this evening at the deadly sin of anger, as well as the virtue of prudence. James is with his mother, who is having knee replacement surgery today, somewhere. She lives in Goshen, but I don't know where the hospital is they went to. Maybe Harrison. So he'll be back next week. So I'm left to deal with prudence tonight as well. Let's just jump in, because there's a whole lot to deal with anger. And if I haven't caught any of you up to this point in time, probably I've got a good chance of it this evening. Or maybe I'm just speaking to myself. So when we jump into the issue of anger, let's just do kind of the same approach we've done on each of these other nights. We're talking about indignation, wrath, rage, and all of the various components that has. It's usually some kind of a sustained attempt on our part to get even with somebody else. Whether we ever mean for that to become physical, it may just be verbal, and it may just be mental. But we intend to get even, so there's this element of vengeance that is involved often with anger as well. And of course, the mental image that comes to my mind, and it probably, you've seen this too, you've probably done this too, but you're driving down the road and you see people in their car just having these imaginary conversations. You know what they're doing, because you've done it too. Or they're running, or they're jogging, or whatever, and they're having this conversation, and they're the only person there, and there's no sign of a phone or any of those white things people stick in their ears to make you think that they're really having a conversation with someone else. Anger, that's what we're looking at tonight. It's a refusal to forgive the other person. If we were able to forgive, if we were willing to forgive, our anger would be alleviated, dealt with. But it's because we don't forgive that we have all of these anger issues. I'm really not sure why my screen just did that, but we withhold mercy from other people. And so really one of the main forms that anger takes in our lives, if you stop to think about it, is hatred. We tend to hate the person that we are angry with. At least at some level. This may be temporal. It may not be a permanent thing, but at least right at that moment, there is hatred going on. As well as an obsession. I was talking with Tom a bit earlier about Australian Shepherds and the way they obsess and focus on particular things. Well, we do that too. We sort of get addicted. We're obsessed with that other person. They control our thoughts, and in the midst of that, we don't want to bless them anymore. We just want to bless them out. We want to hurt them. And so that obsession begins to consume us. It not only eats away at us, but it consumes us. If we could let go of it, we'd be in much better shape.
There's a source you want to quote.
Yeah. You read Siddhartha that he wrote? We get fixated on whatever the hurt is that the other person inflicted upon us, won't let it go, and we want to simply inflict it back upon the other person. Whether you can or not, I can testify that is a true quote. All right, so Dante, we've dealt with him several times. He talks about there being two types of anger. There's kind of the internal version, and there's the external version. The internal version is sullenness, pouting that we do, the resentment that builds up within us, the surliness that develops within us, our moodiness, the way we're crabby with other people, That's what he's speaking about. And then there's the kind that tends to be focused outside of us, and it involves us ultimately, if we can do it, where we're actually inflicting damage on the other person, which he calls wrath, the anger that spews out, as opposed to the anger that boils up within. Anger that spews out in some kind of a harmful act. If you've read the Inferno, the angry people in hell are wrestling with each other and punching each other in a muddy river. And it's more mud than it is river. And so most of the people that are in there, they're just bubbles that come up to the surface. That's how you know that it's full of angry people. If you're lucky enough to not be in hell, but are in purgatory, the people that are angry in purgatory, the way that it's getting taken out of them is that they are being blown around by these hurricane gust winds, because that's precisely how they were living. Their passions were blowing them from one thing to the next. So the punishment, if you will, fits the crime. Here's Dante with Virgil crossing the river, and you can see the people down in the river as well as the bubbles showing other folks. Anger's what Dante called one of the perverted loves. It's totally focused upon the self as opposed to the other that it should be focused on. And so it elevates the self in inappropriate ways. We so focus on ourselves that anybody who belittles us, we think of what we call our righteous indignation, that it's appropriate for us to knock them down a peg or two. Well, Jesus said something or other about that, didn't he? It's not good enough to just love those who love you, love your friends, but you need really to love your enemies. Everybody loves their friends, but setting us up then for some other things that he will say later during his ministry, that you need to love your enemies as well. You don't hate them. Don't stay angry with them. You need to love them. You need to forgive them. Well, in classical literature, which does spend an awful lot of time dealing with anger, most of the writers talk about anger being something that puffs us up. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Something that swells inside of us, too. You can see the swelling and puffing taking place here. And in the midst of all of that, we get rather excited. Excitable might be a better term. It's not that we're happy excited. It's that we're frenetic excited. That's about the level that some of us quote scripture, isn't it? We know the first part. So in Greek, thumos is one form of anger, orge is the other. You don't need to remember any of that, but thumos is the wrath that tends to boil up inside of us, the smoke that kind of curls out of our ears. It's what makes us hot under the collar, all that internal brooding that we tend to do. That's what that first word is referring to. Well, so here's our K-State map, this time showing where anger or wrath is. And they put this map together on the basis of major crimes. So those places where murder, and assault, and rape were most frequent. We got some problems on that one. We got some major problems on that one, at least back in 2008, 2009. I'm really not sure why we have the issue about Little Rock, but I guess I don't need to know. The other wrath is not the kind that boils up so much in us, it's the kind that boils out of us, where we want to inflict it upon other persons. And even if we don't harm them physically, this is the anger where we want to harm them verbally. It's what gives rise to insults, mockery, all of those kinds of verbal ways that we harm other people.
Is there a special message or anything for Florida and some of the other southern
Well,
states?
you know, if you've been paying attention, Florida has been bright red every single week. And the South generally has been bright red. I don't know what the message is. You can make up your own message, but it just kind of has its own message, doesn't it? Of course, California is the same way. Here's Hieronymus Bosch. So the guy on the right, parts of this one I'm not really sure about, but the way I interpret this particular image of anger is that the guy on the right is probably engaged in theft to start with from the woman. He's taken from her a pitcher that's in his left hand, and he's getting ready to then harm her. And I'm assuming that the guy on the right is her husband. And so they've engaged in, well, if it was today, fisticuffs, but they've got knives. Or maybe it would have been fisticuffs back then. Today it's knives. But at any rate, they're having a knockdown, drag out, and you can see clothing and tipped over tables and all sorts of things. They're really into it with each other. Well, the aim of anger is almost always to engage in some kind of vengeful act. I already mentioned that. Some way to exact punishment on the other person. If we're more shy about some things, it's most likely going to be verbal. If we're more boisterous, it may be physical, in which we hurt them. Anger can often become pretty quickly an out of control emotion, an out of control passion that we think we're in charge of, but quickly realize that we are not. And once it's out of our control, which doesn't take very long, then it leads to all kinds of other evils as well. Now, there's a large part of classical literature, certainly, but then also when we get into Old and New Testaments, which we will in just a moment, that talks about wrath being something that God has. Now, there was an important New Testament scholar early in the 20th century who helped translate what becomes the New English Bible. It's a wonderful translation in case you haven't used it at all much, but he was an English scholar, wonderful gentleman, and wonderful scholar as well. He was the leading person behind the translation of the New English Bible. He did not believe in the wrath of God. And so anywhere where the wrath of God is mentioned in Scripture, he simply deletes it. So if you don't like the wrath of God, the New English Bible it's completely missing from that translation. We could spend a lot of time talking about the wrath of God, but I really don't want to do that because we don't even have hardly enough time to talk about the sinful ways that we engage with anger. And since we're talking about the deadly sin, I'm mostly going to leave to the side the wrath of God. Not because C.H. Dodd did, but because we don't have time to deal with it much. Gandhi is one of those guys that when you need a quote, you should just simply read it. All right, Old Testament. James often will, on his portions of our studies, talk about how many times a word shows up in Scripture. Well, anger shows up more than 400 times in the Old Testament. It's very present there, and often refers, as you can see here, to rage, wrath, various forms of agitation. There's just all kinds of synonyms that can be used here. While this is not a major part of Old Testament, this is probably what we think of when we think of Old Testament wrath.
Oh, God.
Eye for eye is really not present at all very much in the Old Testament. But, and in fact, eye for eye, tooth for tooth is limiting, is exercising great control on what can be done with wrath, making sure that it doesn't go very far. So if somebody pokes out your eye, well, then it's okay for you to poke their eye out, but you can't poke their eye out and cut their tongue off. You can't escalate it. In other words, it can only be eye for eye. Would that that's the way it were today. Not literally, but if we could stop the escalation, we'd be in much better shape. Different sins have different body parts that are connected to it. One that gets connected with anger is the nose. Flaring nostrils. And that taking the deep breath, which then has to be released. So in the Old Testament, it's often connected with a horse. And so if you're reading in Proverbs, for instance, or in Job, because of course you remember everything we talked about in Job, Job talks about God's anger being like a horse. You blow God, and nobody can withstand the force of your nostrils breathing its air out among us. Here's that text from Job. It adds some real depth to it if you know that he's thinking of God as a horse, doesn't it? And that those flaring nostrils. Henry Fairley, F-A-I-R-L-I-E, British editorialist kind of writer, becomes an American citizen back in the 50s, 60s, grandson of a Presbyterian preacher who ultimately becomes one of the best political editorialists in America back in the early 70s. In fact, he's the one who talked about the establishment and made that part of the words that we use. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, the best book on the 7 deadly sins was written by Henry Fairley, F-A-I-R-L-I-E. An older book now, back in the mid-70s. This was before he drunk himself to death. But it's insightful with every single one of the deadly sins. Even when you don't agree with them, you go, yeah, I see it at least. I don't like what you just said, but boy, it's certainly true. Here's the illustration that deals with anger. And it's a biblical illustration. Can you figure out who that is and what's going on?
Is it Jonah under the...
Yeah.
Is it the broom tree?
Go ahead and say just a bit more then, since you got that far.
Well, Jonah got angry when Nineveh repented, because he was really wanting God to destroy them.
Who did he get angry with?
He got angry with God. And so he basically went out into the wilderness and sulked. He found a broom tree, right?
Yep.
And that was his shade, and then God shriveled the broom tree, which... yeah. So.
There you go. There's the illustration for anger in Henry Fairley's book. Now, in the Old Testament, anger can sometimes be neutral. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Most of the time it's a bad thing, but it can be at least a neutral thing, sometimes even a positive thing. Think, for instance, when Moses comes down the mountain and destroys the tablets on that first occasion. It talks about Moses being angry because of what he hears going on down at the base of the mountain. And there that anger is basically Moses is enacting how God is feeling, how God is seeing everything. So there, it is definitely a positive. But most of the time, it's not positive, and most of the time, it exhibits something very, very different, such as here. Insult is the word for anger. It's been translated here as insult. So the consequences all the way through the Old Testament of evil are usually negative. They're uncontrollable often, and uncontainable once they get started. Things begin to spiral out of control. Think, for instance, the story of Cain and Abel. Something that starts out fairly innocently, and a conversation escalates very quickly and is no longer manageable. In God, if we were to again kind of bring back to that righteous indignation stuff, the emotion of wrath is not something that God dwells on. It is a momentary thing and then is over with. And that's what you see here in Psalm 30. Who was I talking to in the last week in which I mentioned this very verse? Was it one of you? No, it was James Stroud. I remember mind blank here for a moment. This is embarrassing. When evangelists come and preach, what do you call those things? Revival, thank you. Apparently I need one. So I'm listening to there's a revival in our church. Gosh, I'm probably 10 years old, might have been 11. Lenny Weishart, he's probably dead, long dead by now. But anyway, Lenny Weishart was the evangelist, and he's preaching on all the ways that life tends to go bad for us. And he's quoting from here in Psalm 30. And he gets to the point that weeping may indeed, but it's only going to be for the night. Now, you need to know he was also a singing evangelist. He did both the singing and probably got paid double for that. But he had a wife. His wife's name was Joy. And in the midst of all of this, he starts working in how he's dating this lady who eventually is going to become his wife, and in the midst of feeling so bad, he just didn't know if he could go on. Then suddenly, Joy showed up in the morning. I don't remember anything else about that sermon. But it's, like we all do, I remembered the illustration, which is why I use very few illustrations in my sermon. It probably doesn't help you remember the sermons, but at least you aren't going to remember just the illustration. That doesn't have anything to do with anything. When we make the switch over into the New Testament, in many ways, there's not really a switch. It's really continuing what we've learned in the Old Testament, except there's more emphasis on how it's the opposite of forgiveness. In fact, it keeps people from being able to forgive. That in fact, as I said earlier, if you would forgive, it would begin to diminish the anger that you feel within you. So here's some of them. There's just scores and scores of places we can turn to in the New Testament that deal with anger, but here's a small number of them. Think about the Lord's Prayer. Why is it important that you forgive other people? We've never had that issue in our house. This is the same issue in the Lord's Prayer. It's just in parabolic form. If you remember this particular parable, he's been forgiven of all kind. He's been forgiven of this massive, massive sum, and then one of his fellow servants comes up and is owed just a little bit of money by him, and he throws him in prison and wants to be refunded very quickly, and then he ends up being thrown into prison because he doesn't forgive his fellow servant. Most people think, well, that's really terrible of God to basically unforgive the guy, and that's not what's going on in that parable. He's been forgiven. God doesn't take back the forgiveness. The problem is he's not sharing mercy. And because he's not sharing mercy, he's imprisoned until he decides he's going to share mercy. That's why he's in prison, not because of that huge indebtedness that he could never repay. It's because he refuses to be merciful. And all he has to do is be merciful to get out. He won't do it. If you don't know what that verse is, look it up when you get home. Here's another one. This is the one that Phyllis Diller didn't quite quote correctly. Anger is one of those things that we work hard at sustaining. I read somewhere that if we count how long, or get a clock and count how long we can stay miserably angry, supposedly it's 17 seconds. I think that's a little low, but that's what I read. Beyond that, you have to will yourself to stay angry. That's ultimately the point. And whether it's 17 seconds or 17 minutes or 17 months, at some point in time, we begin willing ourselves. We want to stay angry. We have something in that we want to do harm to the other person.
Looks like Grandfather Walton.
Yeah, a little bit. This particular verse, I chose it because there's a suggestion kind of inherent in the verse where here anger is somewhat verbal, and it's really difficult if you are angry to pray. And conversely, if you are praying, it's really difficult to be angry. If Chris is having problems with Jim, one of the surest ways for Chris to stop having problems with Jim is to start praying for Jim. If you're willing to do that, pray for the person who's hurt you, or you think has hurt you, or for whatever reason you have something, a beef with, start praying for that person, and you can't stay angry. If you do stay angry, you'll stop praying. One or the other is going to happen. And that's part of the suggestion in this verse. And so, as is often the case throughout much of the New Testament, anger ends up being one of those sins that is included in lists everywhere. That's one of the things to be avoided. And look at most of the things in this particular verse. They're all verbal. Not entirely, but many of them are. So again, it's getting into that ways that we hurt other people by the things that we say, so either to them or about them. I have a brother and sister, both younger. And anytime we would go on vacation, even though Dad had a Pontiac Catalina, which was huge by comparison to most vehicles today, still, and even though I sat on the far right in the back seat, put 3 kids in the back seat, they're close enough to touch you. And it's amazing the anger that gets spewed in the back seat of a car when you're on a trip. And I'll let you run with that from there. Just another version of the Ephesians text. Anger can end up being a pretty passionate sin of the mouth. And then there's always James. And what's valuable about this particular text is it begins to bump up against what we like to call our righteous indignation, where we think we are entitled to be angry at some injustice out there, when in fact it might have started that way, but it often gets far beyond that or far different from it pretty quickly. It's not so much the injustice that we're trying to correct as it is we have an outlet against whom we can be angry. And that includes, I think, also a word to preachers about hellfire and damnation sermons. We aren't really accomplishing any good thing for God if we're just screaming bloody murder and telling people how bad they are. It's been a dozen years ago now. Some folks at the Mont Eagle Church down by Sewanee, where I was at, there was a couple that wanted me to go to a Screwtape Letters presentation down in Chattanooga at the Tivoli Amphitheater or Theater. So went down there, and as I parked my car and I'm walking up whatever that road was in Chattanooga, and I'm hearing all kinds of commotion up ahead of me. As I got closer, there was a street preacher out there who had a sign. He was basically screaming bloody murder at everybody, saying that the wages of sin is death. Well, of course, nobody's paying any attention to him. A few who are were cursing him. But he was going about his, just marching up. And, he must have been doing it there because he thought there was something wrong about C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. But didn't pay any attention. I just went in, watched my thing. But I do recall thinking at the time, and I have many times since, that he'd have had much more, his sermons, such as they were, would have been much more better received if he'd been quoting the second half of that verse. Do you know the second half of the verse? The wages of sin is death, but
It's eternal life.
the gift of God is eternal life. Blah, blah, blah. So, that would at least have opened up a door, an entree for people to listen to it. But he stayed on this side, the verbal anger. Well, when you make the switch over into Christian theology, anger is not so much just getting mad and then getting over it, but it's that kind of a knowing, willful decision to not get mad, but to stay mad at the other person. So there's a strong sense of resentment, of bitterness, and then ultimately of hatred involved in it. And just like I talked about earlier in the classical versions, there's the acted out form of anger, as well as the form that sinks into our gut and just drives us crazy. The acted out version of wrath, which often leads to murder or violence of various kinds. And then the contained part is what makes us so sullen. Like this. I can remember John Mark looking that way a time or two, more than a time or two. One of my favorite cartoons is about an old couple. One of the things I miss about not having a newspaper these days is being able to keep up with pickles. Wait for it. Is he sullen? Well, then there's that kind of righteous judgment we want to call righteous judgment that I mentioned earlier that we can talk about, but I'm going to skip most of that. But that's what often happens with it. It doesn't stay there. So our cries for justice often turn into some kind of a justification or a rationalization for why we can be angry with the other person. So I have finished my first, well, I'm probably close to finishing my first year of college. So for whatever reasons, on this particular day, I'm back home, and my brother has a church basketball. He played basketball at school, but he was on a church league as well. So he's playing basketball at the gym, and they're playing this other team that the officiating was really bad. I mean, as it sometimes can be. I mean, and it just really was. And my brother's team was getting trounced, not by the other team, but by the officiating. It just was bad. Well, but you know, the guy that was officiating was probably my age, you know, and I don't know how easy it is for church leagues to find referees, but he found this guy and he could have done a better job. So at the end of the game, after my brother's team had lost, I stepped out of the stands and I walked down to the floor of the basketball court, and I read this poor young man, my age, the Riot Act. And within the first 3 or 4 seconds of it, his visage drops. But did that stop me? No. I talked about his inability, even with a pair of glasses, to be able to see. You know? And after I had somewhat exhausted, because I didn't tend to usually do that sort of thing, I just did it in my head, you know. But on this occasion, I told him what I thought of him, and it hurt the poor guy. And I can't tell you how bad I felt about that. Bad enough that now, you know, 40 years later, I still remember it like it was yesterday. And I made myself a promise that I would never again be that way at a basketball game or any other kind of game that I go to. And having had the pleasure of going to a few basketball games with Dixon, he can tell you, well, he just sits there like a bump in a log in his seat. He doesn't do anything at those basketball games. It's the other people around us that are doing all the screaming. It's just absolutely inappropriate what I did and what we all do from time to time. I mean, it's okay, I suppose, to blither when we're watching a TV screen about a football game, but it gets much beyond that. there's something incredibly wrong with it. So, if one is angry about things that took place in the past, oops, that's not where I need to be. Among immature people, which could be anywhere from teens down to very young children, one of our reactions when things happen to us, the form that anger often takes is fear and screaming. Because, and think here about an infant that is afraid he or she isn't going to be fed again. They want some milk and there's no bottle, there's no breast right there. So they start screaming. That's one form that anger can take, which is perfectly fine. As we get older, we don't scream. We either do the flight or fight version when something like that happens. I can remember going down to the pond that's no longer across the street from me on my grandpa's property. He was out in a boat in the middle of the pond fishing, and this particular evening, there were lots of loggerhead turtles sticking their heads up. So I asked my grandpa if I could go back and get his .22 rifle. Sure. Well, it had been 2 or 3 years since I'd fired that thing, and this was an old single shot thing where you had to set the safety. Well, I'd forgotten that you had to set the safety. I remembered you had to pull it down, but I forgot you had to set it. So every time I'd put in a bullet, I'd flip that thing in, pow! One more, I'd flip it down, pow! It's surprising I didn't shoot my grandpa out there. He sat perfectly still in the boat, never moved. And at some point, I must have done that a dozen times and finally decided, I don't know how to shoot this silly gun. And I just turned around and walked back up to the farmhouse and deposited the gun. And he never, ever, till the day he died, ever asked me to go out hunting with him. Never again. So I can commiserate with the poor gentleman here. Where it becomes sinful is in that child who, even though they're getting fed, wants to hold on and throws, instead of just screaming, begins to throw a temper tantrum. That's inappropriate, as opposed to the fear that you are or are not going to be able to be fed. And even though this is not a child, there's the temper tantrum. And, even though people will sometimes say that, well, you just need to vent. You just need to let it out. Trouble with that is that doing that, there comes a point often where you can't keep that under control. You can't contain it, and it begins to take advantage of you. So venting really does the escalating of the anger that we have. It begins to give it some credence. And it helps to just dig that rut that we can't get out of. Benjamin Franklin is also one of those guys that he said enough things that you can find him to be able to quote him for most anything you want. Jesus will, in the Gospel of Matthew, talk about how if you're holding on to a grudge, it's really hard for you to be able to worship, at least worship appropriately. Do you remember what he says you need to do. Actually, it talks about somebody having a grudge against you, which makes worship not possible. But do you remember what you need to do to make worship possible when you're in that situation? Someone has a grudge against you and you remember it in worship?
Go make amends.
Yeah, go make amends. Leave your gift at the altar. Go talk. Exercise some forgiveness. And then come back and offer your gift. If you hold on to those grudges, though, and that's something you have to do, you have to hold on to, you have to choose to willingly hold on to it, sooner or later you're going to have to let go of that. Or you're really going to struggle being able to offer worship. Now, if worship is to you just something where it's not where you're offering something to God, it's where you're sitting there getting something in worship, well, that's maybe another matter. But if you're really offering something in worship, it's really tough to have a grudge and be able to do that. Of course, when all is said and done, most anger gets expressed in the home. That's where most violence happens. It's not those people we don't know that are violent against us, it's the people we do know. And we're not so much violent against people we don't know, we're violent against the people we do know. All that fear of stranger stuff is really just a rationalization. We might teach it to our children, but what we're really doing is teaching them how to be angry. This is not true to life. She has not yet thrown a knife at me. But it's all part of our refusal to forgive. And that person that we see, that we have to be around so much, that's the person who gets the brunt of it often. Even if it's nothing more than just a lack of common courtesy. Since I don't golf, I don't really understand that, but I think I get it at least. And part of anger, I thought about finding some World War II propaganda posters, but I don't think I need to have that to make this point. The way anger works is it's really hard to be angry at another person. Somewhere in the midst of that, you have to begin dehumanizing the other person. You've got to transform the other person from a person into an it by turning them into an enemy. And then once you've done that, then the way you talk about them can change entirely. And once you've done that, then you can take out your anger on them. But it's really, thankfully I will never have to be in a war. I was in between all of that stuff, and the draft ended, so I got away with it, but it'd be really hard to shoot somebody that that you don't have any reason to hate. It's just another person who's stuck in the same situation you are. But if I can dehumanize the other person, then I can. Now, those of you who've been in military, you might want to take odds with that a little bit, and then be perfectly okay. But that's my take on it, at least. When your anger is connected with things that have already happened, something happened in the past, your anger often takes, at least at some level or another, often takes the form of hatred against the person. You hate them because of what they did. And so if that's where most of your hatred boils up because of a past event, well, then at some point in time, you're going to have to be willing not just to forgive, but also to forget. There has to be some redemption of that past event for you to be able to get over your anger. If your anger is not so much because of something that happened in the past, but is because of something that is in the future, something that hadn't happened yet, but you're sure it's going to, that often takes the form of despair. Because there isn't a blasted thing you can do about it. It hadn't happened yet. So it's only despair that you can have about some yet to occur event. So to get past that anger, you've got to begin, well, first of all, not paying it any attention, but you got to start overlooking that. You can't focus on it. And if you're angry about something that you're in the midst of living right this very moment, something in the present, anger often takes the form of resentment. You resent that you have to be in the midst of this. Some, if not several of you, have heard me talk from time to time about subdivision on my property. It's dumping all their water across my property. Yeah, I've got some resentment about this stuff that you know, I keep holding on to as opposed to letting it go. But to be able to let it go, I've got to begin to tolerate it a bit. It's not ending my world that the water's there, although it's still doggone it. This is one of the wisest comments I know. And if you don't get it the first time, read it again. So what are some of the forms of anger? Well, here's 4 of them. Verbal aggression, it's all that sarcasm that we engage in, which really is an interesting word. Those of you who know at least a smattering of Greek, you know that the Greek word for flesh is sarx, sarcasm. We're tearing the flesh of the other person when we're engaging in sarcasm. We're ripping them to shreds. That's what we're doing. Cursing, slander, insults, knife in the mouth stuff. When somebody says to you, may I be honest with you? You know that what they're getting ready to say is not going to be good. It's not going to be kind. Physical aggression, that takes the form of vengeance, punishment, cruelty. Could be war, violence, terrorism, lots and lots of different ways that we can be physically angry with people, aggressive with people. Then there's psychological aggression. That's all the mockery, propaganda, hatred, refusal to forgive, the way we treat people with scorn. And the final form is that passive-aggressive kind of anger, where you give somebody the silent treatment. You withhold your affection, refuse to display any kind of enthusiasm over what's being talked about. You're persistently tardy, you drag your feet, refuse to cooperate. Lots and lots of different ways we can do that. Bottom line is, we're just obstinate, just stubborn. Some of the evils to which anger can give birth, there's really the passive-aggressive form right there. I'm sure Patty's sitting over there going, yeah, it's about time you started talking about some of this stuff. So some of the evils to which anger gives birth. That first one I think is interesting, but it's really true. All kinds of conspiracy theories, paranoia, all the imaginary plottings that go on out there. You know, and I'm not talking right-wing political stuff that involves this, or left-wing political stuff that involves national events. I'm just talking that you think somebody's got something against you because they're constantly seem to be yakking or laughing behind your back and stopping when you look at them, sorts of stuff. That's a conspiracy theory right there. Your spouse mislays your socks somewhere. You can't find them. Well, they're hiding them from you. That's a conspiracy theory. Thomas Jefferson's version of that was when angry, count to 10. If very angry, count to 100. But I like this one better. Well, that's the cursing, the bad language version of an evil to which anger gives license. Our words don't square with truth. They don't square with what's really taking place. And it's a form of escalation. Rather than just dealing with it up front, we try to up the ante by hurting the other person by saying something. And then there's always revenge. Which, you know, is a kind of usurping God's role in life. But God's role is really mercy extender. It's not Thor with a big hammer smacking people, but when we usurp God's role, that's the role we tend to go for. We want to render God's judgment upon others. And then we can always be cruel as well. And that's where Peter Bruegel's engraving goes this time. There's the woman, once again, the oversized one in the middle. She's been hurt. Her arm's in a sling. But look what she's got in her mouth. A knife. Well, we've all said cutting things. I've owned up to a few I've done this evening, but that's what she's got, that cutting knife in her mouth. Here's your parade down on the bottom. It's a warrior, an army man of some kind leading a charge, and they're cutting down. We actually even use that language, don't we? To cut down the enemy. And as you look in other places, there's dog fights, and there's other fights, and there's people fights, and here's a demon that's basting some guy on a spit right in the middle. But all kinds of fighting everywhere you look. Because I can't make the suffering that I'm experiencing stop. I figure I'll just make other people suffer right alongside me. That's, again, part of that escalation. And even one of the last forms that it can often take is just plain impatience. We're no longer patient with other people like we ought to be, which is one of the forms in which my self-importance becomes even more self-importanter. You're wasting my time. And there's 1,000 different ways that we can do that, even when we think it's a good thing we're doing. Think for a moment, and I'll just give one example, like social workers or other people who work with others. They set limits on when and how those people can approach them. Don't you, and even preachers, not all, but some will do it. Don't you dare call me beyond such and such a time. My hours are this. Don't disturb me. My time is my time. It is not yours. I'll be nice to you between 9 and 3. Well, doggone it, there's reasons why we don't get any healing done anymore. You can't compartmentalize healing. Healing takes time. It involves relationships. And those are messy, and they are time-consuming. And they are messy, and they are time-consuming. That's the only way it works. Well, one of the best anger detectors in us is just to ask the question, am I willing to forgive other people? Do I actually forgive other people? And if I don't, pretty good indication I've got some anger issues to have to deal with. Why am I holding on to the anger that I have? If you're one of those that engages in all kinds of imaginary conversations where you ream out your boss or your child or your parent or your friend or whoever, probably a pretty good chance you've got some issues to deal with there. And the remedy, it's simple, but not simple to do. Practice forgiveness. One of the things I think the church needs to do, it's got to do, is we've got to start implementing in our liturgy opportunities for forgiveness to take place. Because we don't know how to do it anymore. And we need to liturgically make it available so we can practice it and practice it and practice it so that outside church we might actually be able to engage in it as well. The sad thing here is that we're the monkey. All right, one last quote from Gandhi. Ready for prudence? We'll switch over to prudence now. The years when I was in Nashville, when I was at the publishing house, I often discovered that every September I would get phone calls from local clergy wanting me to come preach because they were going to be gone. Well, if you know the lectionary, you know that often, in almost all 3 of the years of the lectionary, in September, you've gotten to that place in the Gospels where Jesus is talking about divorce. So I learned regularly that if I'm getting a call to come preach for me in September, that was the reason. They had looked ahead and realized what the text was going to be. And so they were inviting me to come talk about divorce. I don't think that's why James is not here tonight. I get to talk about prudence this evening. So, in talking about prudence, let's jump back to a place where we mentioned this the very first night, but then we didn't do anything more with it. These trees that were made available way back in the early medieval times. There are trees of vices, and probably you can't see from where you are, and it's in Latin anyway, but the left bottom branch is anger. And you see that branch has 7 more branches dangling from it. Those are the 7 forms of anger where anger leads to these additional sins. And even if you can't read the stuff in through there, you can see that there are a couple of dragons up toward the top, so that probably is a pretty good indication that this is the vice side of the tree. But then there's also virtues. And in this particular one, prudence is the bottom right. And notice that we don't have fruit drooping, we have fruit rising. These took many, many different forms. Here's one that has both vices and virtues, or virtues and vices. The vices are on the left, because the left is sinister anyway, and the virtues are on the right. And again, you'll see that there's 7 leaves on each branch. And here's one that's not picture form per se, it's more verbal, but the same idea. This one's in French, I guess. Prudence is the second one on the right. And so it has the 7 forms that prudence gives life to, the fruit that come out of prudence. So lots of these are available. And here's yet another way that you could deal with vices or virtues. You could personify them. Often, whether they're vices or virtues, they often end up being women. Prudence is the first one over here on the left. And once you kind of learn the form, you can then pick them out anywhere that you see them. The leftmost woman, Prudence, she always has a mirror in her hand. She always has 2 faces. You can't really tell that in this where you are probably, but if you could see the back of her head, there's an old man's head on the back of her young woman's face on the front. This is not the Harry Potter thing, but there's an old man's face and a young woman's face. There's always the mirror, and then she always has a snake in her other hand. Do you want to try to weigh in quickly as to why any of those 3 things always are a part of prudence? Mirror, self-reflective, able to discern truth, think about what's happening, what has happened, where you are in the midst of it. That's going to play into prudence. The snake, the ability to handle and deal with problems that arise in objective, appropriate, good ways. And the old man's head providing wisdom. Yeah. That enables you to be able to do well with those other two. So that's prudence. Those three aspects of prudence show up all the time. Prudence ends up, as a virtue, being perhaps the most important of the virtues. For the other virtues to work, for the other virtues to be virtuous, you do have to have prudence, or the others just don't function very well. We'll say more about that in just a moment. Here is another form of that, and this one you can probably see it a little easier. You see the two faces, the snake, the mirror. And here's yet one more version. This is Giotto's version in the chapel. If you look really, really close, you can see that's not just curls on the back of her head. It is the face. In this one, she doesn't have the snake. This particular chapel, as you're walking toward the altar, these are frescoes that are kind of at the base of the chapel as you're walking up toward it. And on one side are the virtues, and on the other side are vices. Not necessarily the ones we've been dealing with, but they are there nonetheless. Apart, on the other side is the antithesis of this particular virtue or vice, whichever we're looking at. So on the other side, apart from prudence, is foolishness. No, that's not a Native American, but he does have feathers that he's sporting and just being silly. At an etymology level, I didn't realize this until I was working on this for tonight. Prudence is actually a contraction of the word providence, which is just incredibly enlightening. Prudence has the ability to provide what is needed. Okay, some definitions. I'm going to do the same thing here with prudence as I've done with each of the various sins. Contemporary definitions, if we were to say, well, what does prudence mean? Folks today would probably say, well, some kind of caution, excessive caution. You're being very, very cautious if you are prudent. You're reluctant to take any kind of risks. That's not true. That's Samuel Johnson's version of it. If we didn't talk about sort of a reluctance to take risks, we probably today would say, well, the person who is prudent is cunning. They're kind of savvy. They're willing to manipulate to get their way. Whatever decision they make, it's calculated to some particular end that they want to achieve. Or the person offering a contemporary definition of prudence would say, well, you're a prude. That's why you're prudent. you have this overarching modesty about whether it's sexuality or dress or language or whatever. That's what prudence is about. Again, I don't agree with it, but the more classical definition of prudence is that which allows you to arrive at your best behavior. To put it in just a couple of words, prudence is practical wisdom. And again, that was to me just sort of eye-opening, which lets me understand this virtue in a completely different way. And that is then very quickly the explanation of why the other virtues don't work if you don't have prudence. You've got to be able to practically apply whatever you're doing in real down-to-earth situations for it ultimately to be virtuous. So classically, practical wisdom dealt with this world kinds of stuff. The way you associate with other people, your relationships, the ability to make good decisions about whatever, whenever, how you rear a family, how you raise your kids, how you deal with problems that you're facing, kind of big or small, those who it might be. When prudence takes on more of a Christian version, it's still very much practical wisdom, but in addition to just being that way that we deal with earthy, everyday situations with other people, it becomes a way that we deal with heavenly stuff. So that practical wisdom has to do with, well, how do we become righteous? How do we help other people become righteous? How do we live the kind of life that we can be assured at the end of it we are heaven bound as opposed to being hell bound? How do we love God? That's what prudence is all about from a Christian perspective. How do we accomplish that? How do we use the things of the world to be able to love God? How do you, Paul in Colossians 3 talks about having the mind of Christ. That's prudence, the mind of Christ. It's almost equivalent, if you will, to conscience, broadly speaking. Does it kind of make sense? All right, we'll see how much it makes sense. So I have some discussion questions for you. Question 1 is going to be dealt with here. Question 2 is going to be dealt with here. Question 3 is going to be dealt with here. You guys can choose whichever one of the three you want to deal with.
Be prudent.
Yeah. We're going to see how prudent you guys are here. Now, I'm only going to give you a couple minutes because, it's time's moving. So you got a couple minutes, and then you're going to explain your decision in about 30 seconds or less. Okay? So, this is, got to get it done. So here's yours. You're on the road. It's rush hour. You're in a car, line of cars. Cars in front of you, that's what makes the line. There's cars behind you. There's a car over here coming out of a parking lot or a driveway or a whatever, side street, and they want to get in. Do you let them in? Be prudent about your decision, whether you let them in. Okay, that's what you guys get to talk about. So somebody's you're on the street, you've just watched a show, it's late at night, this is urban setting, and some guy comes up to you and wants money. Do you give him money? Or do you buy him a meal? Be prudent about what you do with that guy who came wanting some money. And yours over here. Do you spend time with a friend, or do you spend time with your family? Address that one prudently. Got 2 minutes.
Okay. I'm not saying this is prudent, but there's a couple of places on the street that I've noticed this one lady.
Did you let him?
Yeah, I stopped. Just because something struck me. Didn't know what her story was, but you could tell that it wasn't true. And somebody asked me why did you do that. I don't really have great explanation other than this kind of gut feeling.
Well, I tried to
lady.
I would speak.
So this person's coming up to you, a stranger, you don't know what his intentions are. So if you take that from
Oh, leaving a ball game is the worst.
push you into
So you
alley.
you see, you came out of a theater, so you're coming out of a show, right? So he knows that with money go to the shows,
or buy him.
Yeah. Right, right.
I can think of many scenarios like you're saying where it would be
There you go.
something bad would happen.
Well, yeah, right.
It's like in New York, example years ago.
Yeah, 1970s.
Yeah.
Yeah, how bad it was before.
Well, there was a particular case. Where
By the way.
all these people
No, no.
lived in the buildings she did, but they didn't take any action. And I forget what her name was, but she was on all that.
All right, you all have had enough time. So tell me what the prudent thing to do in this driving situation is.
Well, we said it depends. If the traffic is not going 60 miles an hour, you can slow down enough that they can get in. But if you've got a whole line that's moving 60 or 70 miles an hour,
Well, I said this was rush hour.
oh, I missed that. Okay.
So they aren't moving.
It's the art movement.
Then let them in.
I have slowed down and have had the person that's trying to slow down with me. It's like,
Yeah, on the on-ramps, you're saying.
yes.
Okay, so if it is rush hour, what would be the prudent thing to do? Do you let the person in or not?
Yeah.
Yep, okay. What's the prudent thing to do here about the guy who's asking you for some money on the street?
We can think of very few situations in which it would be imprudent to offer to buy someone a meal. On the flip side, I can think of several situations where it might be very imprudent late at night in an urban area, especially in a crowded parking lot at a movie theater, to take out a wallet and start showing someone cash.
As a footnote to this, if you wear a collar, it is a magnet to anybody who wants anything.
That's
All right, so do you spend time with a friend or do you spend time with your family?
Kind of depends on who needs you the most.
Man, you're all doing this depends.
Yeah, right.
You can't just make a blanket decision like that.
If your friend is living here and your family's, hundreds of miles away and don't get to see them as often, well, you go see your family, obviously. So.
Okay, all right. And?
What they said.
Well, we actually did talk about all three, and we really did say, depends, find a meal. And
Depends.
well, we said something actually different. We said, friends can be family too. And family can be friends.
We're hedging.
And they're not one.
That's a crafty table back there.
That's that cunning stuff. That is not true. Well, all right. I will not argue with any of the four of you. What you have proven is, A, to be prudent, you've got to have plenty of information that I did not provide you, that you have to fill in. And you've got to fill it in on the fly. If you're in rush hour and that person wants in. If you're on the street. If you're having to face a family versus friend kind of situation. You need information, past, present, future. It's not just simple. There is no one size fits all, like Vanita put it. There's some and in addition to that, there's some experience you've got to have, having dealt with this sort of thing before. That comes into the position as well. Not only do you need some more information, you've got to be able to have the ability to make a decision. Some of us are just indecisive. You don't say to indecisive people, where would you like to eat tonight? You say, do you want to eat at place A or place B? Or you might just need to say, you want to eat at place A. You've got to be able to make a decision. And you need those other virtues. These virtues don't work just by themselves. You can't be prudent without being all the other things that we've looked at, whether it's hopeful, loving, etc., etc. Here's my take. Oh, and so prudence ends up not necessarily making the same decisions that you might think are the right decisions to make. Case in point. And I'll just deal with one here since time is a bit of an issue. When you're in a rush hour situation and you've got 13 cars behind you and there's no cars over here, but then suddenly one pulls up while you're waiting in line, it is not prudent to let that person in. It is prudent if, as you've been gradually making your way up, you've seen that person there waiting and waiting and waiting. But if that person just pulls up and you're the one who has been waiting and waiting and waiting, and you've got 13 cars behind you as well, you choosing to let that other person in, you say, well, it was an act of kindness. Well, what about the 13 people behind you that you were unkind to? You did one act of kindness.
They just diverted in behind you.
To be sure. But you've been unkind 13 times and you've been kind once. You're minus 12 already. You see? So prudence is not necessarily what everybody else thinks is going to be kind. Prudence takes a different tack in its practical wisdom. Absolutely, you'll let them in if you can see they've been waiting, but maybe not if they've not been. Because otherwise, if I'm behind you, your supposed act of prudence just made me mad. I just got angry. Now I got to deal with my anger, and I can't deal with you.
Too bad. Yeah, right.
Road rage. And here's where all those other things come in. Because not everybody's going to see it your way. They think you should have let the person in. You're going to need fortitude as well to stick with your decision. You know? And you're going to need love and hope so that you don't get perturbed that they're upset with you because you... So all those other virtues kick in and become necessary for you to not only be, but to remain prudent. Now, this of course is not an issue if you just let them in and go on about your way. But you see, so prudence, it's a complicated thing. It involves an awful lot to be able to accomplish. Prudence is wisdom, it's practical wisdom. Fortitude is courage. Temperance is self-control. Justice is the rightness of whatever it is you find yourself involved in. Here's 8 parts to prudence. To be able to be prudent, you have to have memory, which I'm going to include as well experience as part of memory. If Franklin stopped talking where the semicolon is, I'd be prudent. But I often want to score the point and go ahead and say what I think, even though it's a self-defeating situation I've just created. I didn't need to say it, and it doesn't help anything. So you've got to have the ability, you've got to have the awareness, and you also have to have the ability to be able to assess actions to be prudent. That's part of memory. Secondly, you've got to be docile. And by that I mean you've got to be teachable. There's got to be enough humility about you that you allow other people to help you learn, which not everybody has. And you have to be not only able but willing to be able to learn from others. Otherwise, their experience does you no good. You have to learn it yourself. Third, you've got to have some intelligence. You've got to be able to reason your way through things. You've got to be able to make logical connections. Okay, this, but how do you put them together to come up with the right decision? Fourth, you've got to be shrewd, which doesn't mean cunning, but it means the ability to argue to a conclusion correctly. Fifth, you've got to be prompt. You can't just, in real life, you can't just sit there and say, well, wait, let me think about this. You have to be able, just like that, to be able to make your decision. You've got to be able to assess whatever is occurring and then determine very quickly what the best means are to the end that you desire. Sixth, you've got to be able to have some foresight. You've got to be able to assess what are the probable ends if I take this particular action. In this particular example here, what's going to happen if I give them $20? Well, they're going to go out and buy some booze, get drunk. So do I do it, or do I just want to get rid of them, or do I do the right thing?
Yeah, make sure you get it down.
You make a decision in this moment regarding an event that hasn't happened yet. You need to be circumspect. You need to be aware of your surroundings in all the forms that might very well take. It's another version of what Benjamin Franklin said. And then finally, you need to have some caution about you. Caution can be a bad aspect of prudence, but it can also be good. This is here talking about the habits that need to be formed in you to be able to act in a careful manner. That's the sense I'm thinking about caution here, with some deliberation. Now, chances are that in whatever situation you find yourself in, needing to be prudent, you're not going to be able to think through each of these 8 steps. They've got to be something that's so much a part of you that you're able to, they all work together to be able to help you, just like that, effectively be able to come up with a decision. So, what are some of the fruit of prudence? Well, the ability to take counsel. It's an aspect of that willingness to be teachable. It's part of what it means to be humble. And you're able to then do a better job of judging the situations that arise around you, which means you can make good decisions, good impartial decisions. You can weigh the appropriateness of whatever the choice is that is before you, as opposed to just getting it over and done with so you can get on to whatever the next thing is. This is a painting by Titian. The allegory of time is his name of it, but it's really dealing with prudence. The man in the middle is needing to make a decision. He has his past over on his left to help inform him. He's making decisions for what shall be. Himself on the other side, his right. Down on the bottom, on the left is a dog, in the middle a lion, on the right a wolf. Decisions are tough things. And you probably can't hardly see that there's writing above the top. It says this, not in English, but learning from yesterday, today acts prudently, lest by his action he spoils tomorrow. Learning from yesterday, today acts prudently, lest by his action he spoils tomorrow. And that kind of puts it all together. So what are some of the marks or signs that prudence is lacking in your life? Well, you're thoughtless. Which is another way of saying you're probably self-opinionated. And you're precipitate, which doesn't have anything to do with raining. But you're swayed by prejudices when you make decisions. Or you're negligent. You're completely unaware of what's going on. You had no idea that guy just pulled up over there on the side of the road. You thought he'd been there a long time. So you thought it was a kindness to let the guy in. You're not able to link present actions to future consequences very well. Or you're inconstant. You're erratic about what you do. Today you do this, tomorrow you do something else. You're unreliable. James has showed us each week a mural, a fresco that's on the ceiling at St. Thomas University. Here's the one for prudence. In Asian culture, I didn't know this until I read the description of it. In Asian culture, a dragon is not a scary beast. It is a symbol of wisdom. Well, the dragon is standing erect, clutching a diploma. This is a university after all. And facing forward, facing the future. Facing the dragon is a recent graduate, standing erect, holding the book of wisdom. And they mirror each other. They have exactly the same pose against each other. Willing to tackle that which lies before them. any of you have Discovery Plus, I guess even if you don't have it, you can always pay to get it. But Pope Francis, this is a 1-hour show in which he talks, it's a conversation, he's answering questions regarding the vices and the virtues. It's a couple years old at this point in time, but it's available right now on Discovery Plus, if that's something that you have available to you. Most any of these popes, the things they say are, if you reflect on them, if you think about them, they're almost always pretty dadgum insightful. And I read a few of the excerpts of this particular show, and I wish I had Discovery Plus. So next week, temperance. As well as gluttony.
I'll bring the food.
All right. We're dependent on Benita next week. Thanks to Chris for bringing the soup tonight, and each of you who brought bread or desserts and so on. Thanks always for that. We'll see you all next week.